This episode of the Mapping the Zone podcast is sponsored by Armand Sandwiches. Have you ever found yourself desiring a fine dining experience, the likes of which can only be found in Paris, France? Do you crave duck de l'orange, paired with a delightful Beaujolais, or the perfect cup of coffee served with a French croissant, folded over a billion times, until it just falls to pieces in your mouth? Have you ever been playing whist and needed one hand to eat and the other hand free to allow you to continue to win like a champion? Let me introduce you to Armand Sandwiches. Food so good, you won't be able to stop shouting, "Yingle yangle, yingle yangle." And as a special coupon for our listeners, any orders placed this month using the code MAPPING save 10%. Armand Sandwiches. Sandwiches so good, you won't be able to stop shouting, "Yingle yangle, yingle yangle."
Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to informal discussion of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Cody. I'm one of the co-hosts.
Hi, I'm Will.
I'm Luke.
Unfortunately, Kate could not join us for this episode. She may jump on later. We're not entirely sure right now, but hopefully she'll be able to. If not, she'll be back next week. We are following the reading schedule from the Pynchon subreddit, and today we're discussing chapters 51 through 55 of Mason and Dixon. This episode has proven to be a little bit of an interesting, somewhat, we were just talking before we started recording, a little bit of a cursed episode in some senses. We've had some technical problems, and our usual summary that Will does was lost to the technological ether. And so we are going to just kind of summarize off the top of our heads in a sort of way, rather than the scripted summary that we typically have. So bear with us as we go through this. But I think we all kind of agree this was a good set of chapters to kind of have this type of review on, just because of the sort of dreamy and surreal nature of especially the two chapters, 53 and 54. So we'll start at the beginning. Will, do you want to kind of start as best you can with remembering what we went through?
Yeah, absolutely. So 51 starts off with essentially a prank war between Mason and Dixon. Mm-hmm. Starting off with Dixon getting a coonskin cap, truly becoming an American at this moment in my mind. And he just decides to jump out from behind doors and stand in corners with the tail dangling over his face, spooking the hell out of Mason. And Mason responds by waking him up in a manner that to me seems pretty low key, but apparently freaks Dixon out quite a bit by ringing a bell over his face.
I thought that was just the most juvenile thing that he probably was the only one who found it funny.
Yeah, it's strange because what is the joke here? You fell asleep? It seems like in the ensuing conversation, both of them had fallen asleep, or were likely to. Mm-hmm. So I'm not quite sure what the joke actually is. But anywho, then we continue onward, and they hear this weird noise, periodic noise in the far distance, and it turns out that so does everyone else, and they can't decide. Some people think it's a set of drums, some people think it's a dog, some people start to wonder if it's a black dog, that kind of haunted, ghostly black dog. And eventually, as per usual, Dixon is the only person in the party with any real guts, and so he sets off in the dark of the night to go see what this sound is. And it's actually the trudging of a large... Let me see how he phrases it. A very large Native American with a net output of light comparable to that of a forge tramping up a river. Which is apparently another piece of local folklore.
Yeah.
They continue on westward and end up finding themselves in this strange cave that's huge, essentially. There are a lot of words devoted to its size, but it's massive. And in the cave, Mason sees these just kind of general allusions to society, to civilization, to religion. But Dixon sees hidden writings on the ceiling of this large dome cavern.
Mm-hmm.
And weirdly enough, Dixon is really upset at the cave. Something about it's really making him unsettled. And he really starts to feel like something about this cave... Something about this cave is eldritch, is how he phrases it.
Yeah. And so I thought, just to kind of take a pause there, that... So I was reading this section for the first time with Mason's journal open, not like a physical. I had Brett's link open, and that part on page 497 where Mason describes it, the entrance is an arch about 6 yards in length and 4 feet in height. That's taken directly from his journal, and it stands out so much within all the other entries leading up to it and after it that it just immediately grabbed my attention. And so I went on this, I probably spent an hour online just trying to find out where that cave was to see if it was something that I could get see pictures of it or anything like that. Never found anything. So I reached out to Brett, and he actually he does cover it in his companion, and I wanted to kind of bring it up real quick because I just thought this was such an interesting little tidbit that he put in there, because not only did he use Mason's words verbatim in the book, but it also, I think Pynchon clued in on the fact that stood out in the journal as well, and spun off this whole thing with Mason and Dixon having these kind of differing views on what it was and its significance. But Brett, in his reply, said, here's the big note I have on the cavern. 498.11, world ellipses stars, as above, so below. See 487.31 and the great chain of being are both relevant here. Mason is having a spiritual epiphany about life, nature, etc. He's used to seeing these ideas in the stars, but recognizing order and beauty below ground as well has shaken something loose. Whether it will last is an open question, but it's worth noting that amid the fear of the uncivilized that opens the episode, Mason has here found a powerful, reverent appreciation for Earth as a natural entity. As Schmidt argues, maybe the key contrast in the novel isn't exactly that between modern and ancient ways of knowing science and religion, but that between heaven-centered versus earth-centered forms of knowledge, both ancient and modern. And he provides a link to that quote. As to the location of the cave, the copy of the journal I used throughout the process has the following note. Unfortunately, the cave, which was about 8 miles east of Hagerstown near Cavetown, Maryland, has been destroyed by rock quarrying in recent years. So, unfortunately, it's no longer available to actually see anything of, but I definitely thought that was a really interesting part of that chapter, just especially how important that cave was. Something that wouldn't really seem too out of the ordinary just becomes this suddenly huge part of both Mason and Dixon's time in that area.
Yeah, it's especially interesting because of just how brief it is. Because, yeah, attention is paid to it. It jumps back to the parlor room and Ives and Ethelmer comment on everything. But it really is, it's a page and a half, really, 2 pages of pretty sparse description of this thing that seems like it's going to be fairly impactful for the characters.
I also did like in this chapter, aside from the prank war, there were some pretty funny parts in here. The fact that I think it was Mason that sleeps with his eyes open, and how much it creeped Dixon out. And I've seen people that do that, and it's weird. So I totally understand that sense of unease when you see someone who is sleeping like that. It's just really unsettling. But it also, there was some really great, and not just in this chapter, but in the subsequent chapters as well. There's some really great horror writing that is kind of scattered throughout here, and where Pynchon's description of the atmosphere and the area that they're in really works to set a really uncomfortable and just disturbing kind of atmosphere.
Yeah, and it's contrasted really well with the humor that really makes up the rest of this chapter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like Dixon being a dog person was one of my favorite parts of this.
Point.
And how misunderstood that ended up becoming.
Well, moving on to chapter 52, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
The leading pair basically, as they turn back after dropping off some of their tools, they turn back to go east and find out, or Dixon finds out, that his mentor Emerson actually isn't as crazy as everybody thinks he is.
Mm-hmm.
That it turns out, he wears his coat backwards because, yeah, it actually makes sense when you're walking through the wind. You don't want that to be where the gap is. And then it evolves into this conversation really about power dynamics, interpersonal power dynamics, and how they shape our world.
Yeah, I really liked the way that Emerson is brought back into this, and I found myself agreeing with him about the coat. Like, and, initially when he pops up and we learn about his crisscross style of dress, like, it's easy to laugh it off. But then, yeah, when someone presents the argument of like, this is why he actually was doing it, it tracks. It makes sense. I would, I don't know why we don't do well. I mean, the explanation for it is in there, but that was, yeah, I found myself like, okay, well, he's got a point.
I'm not sure I'm completely sold. Because, yeah, absolutely, servants make it a lot easier to have a back fastening, or sort of a front fastening coat, because you don't want to be stabbed in the back. But a back fastening coat, I think, would be pretty unfastenable for most people.
That's true. I think it would have to be, maybe that's why I just prefer wearing, like, when I wear like a hoodie or anything, it's a pullover. I don't.
Yeah, I think like a serape or a poncho.
Yeah, that covers everything a little bit better.
And we get to see a conversation shortly afterwards where Mason and Dixon begin recalling and trading stories about their very early years, when some of those later Jacobite rebellions were still happening in northern England, where both of them are from. And for people who don't know, Jacobites are essentially the Stuart lineage of Scottish kings. For about 3 generations ruled the UK. It didn't go too well. I'm not entirely sure about the details on that. But nobody was very happy with it, and that led to the Settlement Act, which, made it so that only English Protestants could be the king of the UK, king or queen of the UK. And Northerners and Scots were not happy about that, so they just had some, we could call them squabbles, civil wars, if you'd like. And both the English armies and the rebel armies would use bagpipes to essentially war cries to terrify the people that they were going into fight. And so that's the thing that both of them recall the best from those periods of their very young lives. This terrifying sound.
Those those scenes, like especially with Mason, there was a really, I thought, really heartbreaking scene where you see some interaction with his father and how much his father looked down on him because of what he wanted to do, because of his want to be an astronomer, and how his father basically just thought it was a useless profession that wouldn't get him anywhere and wouldn't, lead to any respectable accomplishments or anything like that. And I think that, we, at this point in the story, it's been a while since we've heard or seen any interactions between Mason and his dad. So it kind of drives home that relationship that they had and how that has made Mason into the man that he is.
Yeah, and it stands as contrast, not stark contrast, but contrast to the other scenes in which we've seen Charles Sr. In the other scenes, we see him, we see mostly through his perspective, actually. And we see the reasons for what he does. And we see him be cruel, and we see him be mean, and we see him treat his son the way that, probably best not to.
Mm-hmm.
But in this scene, we just have cruelty. There is no reason. There is no plausible argument of, oh, I'm just worried about your future, son. He'd never admit that, but that's what's going on in his head in the other scenes. But in this case, there's nothing like that. He is just being mean to his child.
Yeah. Yeah, especially when when Mason offers to stay and help. His dad's response is, "What do you do? Point your telescope at them? You'll be worse than useless. They'll shoot you the moment that you present them with that vacant face." And like that shit's harsh. Like, just to as a father, like I could never imagine speaking to my kids like that. And it's the fact that Mason is the way he is, I think you can really trace a lot of that back to how his dad treated him. And I think Pynchon does a really good job of presenting someone who went through that kind of not necessarily physical abuse, although I think that was there. I think that was alluded to earlier in the book, but definitely, he's definitely being emotionally abused by his father, and it's definitely shown itself in the way his relationships work.
Yeah, and this is a great example of something that I hope this isn't too controversial, but it is often framed as though physical abuse is somehow an escalation of emotional or mental abuse, however you want to frame it, interpersonal relationship abuse. But this does demonstrate that these horrible things that Mason's father has done are not being beaten, which it sure seems like everyone else in this time period was being beaten by their parents. Maybe not everyone, but the vast majority of people.
Mm-hmm.
Mason's the one with the problems. Mason's the one with the daddy issues, and not to minimize physical abuse in the least, but just to point out it's not an escalation. That they are different. They are not.
Yeah.
There's no ranking them.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. The other thing, so something I thought was interesting in this chapter that I don't know if either of you caught on to this in the same way I did, but there's the mention on 505 where they're talking about Dixon having his infatuation with quote old Hellcat herself, Elizabeth Lady Barnard. There was, so when I looked it up on the Pynchon wiki, just knowing that was going to be a person, I was kind of curious as to who it was. I don't think, and Brett or Luke or Will, correct me if I'm wrong here, I don't think it's who they're saying it is on the Pynchon wiki. So they have it listed as Elizabeth Lady Barnard, formerly Elizabeth Nash, née Elizabeth Hall, was the granddaughter of the famous English poet and playwright William Shakespeare and was also his last descendant. That's true, but the time frame doesn't track, and the fact that she's referred to as Old Hellcat doesn't track either. When I ended up searching up that nickname, that Old Hellcat nickname, I stumbled on Elizabeth Vane, Lady Barnard, who from just regular Wikipedia, I found her disputes, and this, I'm quoting this directly from there, her disputes with her family led to a noted court case, and her ghost is reported to haunt Raby Castle near Durham. For her part in the dispute, Elizabeth gained the nickname Old Hellcat. There really wasn't a whole lot else about her, but that seems to track more with the description of this person in here than the person mentioned on the wiki.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. However, what's the
right.
name of the real, or of the one you think?
Elizabeth Vane is who I stumbled on.
Yeah, no, I was curious if maybe, she would have actually been alive during Dixon's childhood, but
so
nope.
She 1657 to 1725. So that part also doesn't track though, because it's mentioned on page 505 who died back in 42. So clearly not the same time frame. So I don't know. Like I'm not sure if this is some kind of amalgam of those two people. The Shakespeare connection, I get that would make sense, but it she didn't have that nickname. Elizabeth Vane does have that nickname, and Raby Castle, correct me if I'm wrong, has been mentioned in this book before.
Yeah.
So I tend to lean towards that being who this is, but again, that time frame, this is the book is saying she died almost 20 years later than she actually did.
Obviously, this is not a work of primarily historical fiction.
Right.
It is historical, but it is not accurate. Is this an attempt to very clearly delineate this is unreal by having nothing line up?
See, that's what I'm thinking, because the attention to historical accuracy when it's presented as being historically accurate is in my mind, at least, it's really, really detailed and accurate down to at least the information available in the time that this book was written. Obviously, some things may have changed since then, and new discoveries may have been found. But for this to be so, I don't want to say far off, but it's so much more kind of pushed out of that timeline and sort of introducing itself into a sort of alternate history, which I think you could classify this in a sense as an alternate history novel. That definitely could be what he was doing with that. So yeah, Elizabeth Nash, Lady Bernard. See, that's the other thing, is it's listed as BER. Was born in 1608, died in 1670.
Well, this was about that period of time, the time that the book is supposedly, that Mason and Dixon is being told from, is the 1770s, is 1780s, is about the same time that spelling became consolidated. So Barnard, BER or AR would have been the same, I think.
Yeah.
However, there's nothing in here that in the book itself that refers to Elizabeth Vane, is there?
Not that I recall.
It's just that Elizabeth Nash. Nothing refers to Elizabeth Nash. Elizabeth Vane is much closer in terms of death date and fits the character better, for sure. I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah. I'm curious if Brett picked up on that as well, and if he has some insight on that.
Yeah, because even excusing, the thing is that the true inaccuracies we've seen, the historical inaccuracies that are not essentially poetic license that we've seen so far, are basically extensions of poetic license. They are things like Susanna Peach's father being a different Sam Peach from the one who would have had much say in the Dutch East India, the English East India Company.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really, that is just poetic license. This is truly just making stuff up.
Yeah.
All right, it's interesting.
I'd be curious to know what the inspiration was there, how he came on that. Thomas Pynchon, if you're listening, get at us. Let us know. I'm dying to know. That's my only question I would have for you.
Well, so basically, what we're talking around here is that we get a flashback to an even younger Dixon, learning about flying, learning about William Emerson, from creeping around Raby Castle, seeing the ghost of Lady Barnard, walking around with giant red-hot knitting needles.
Yep.
Complaining loudly about her chauffeur being late to escort her somewhere. I mean, she's a ghost. I don't know how the rules of ghosts work in this world. I mean, clearly Rebecca can do whatever the heck she wants. But Rebecca's, losing herself. This woman, it's been at least 10 to 20 years. She seems pretty stable.
Yeah, I mean, enough so to complain about traffic, or what should be the lack thereof.
Yeah, which that scene is hilarious.
Yeah,
but then we find out that is genuinely that kind of non sequitur in the first few chapters of the book, where Emerson tells Dixon, "You just wanted to learn how to fly." Yeah, he meant it literally. He teaches his class how to fly. And then we just get a nice little scene where the titular duo are, they've taken some tent cloth and they've stiffened it up, and they're sledding down hillsides in the snow of the Alleghenies. And except for one issue, they both seem to have forgotten to apply friction to the canvas somehow.
Yep.
As though this is Christmas vacation. And yeah, Mason takes probably the safer route and just flips the sled over so he tumbles off in the snow. But Dixon decides to just see where it takes him, which happens to be a random pile of cushions that just happened to be out in the middle of the road that save him from running headlong into a wagon.
Yeah, that scene, I love it as setting up the ending of this chapter, and it had a very Calvin and Hobbes feel, especially with the sledding and the accidents that come with that, and the just kind of reckless abandon that Dixon has in just letting himself go wherever, as you said, wherever the sled happens to take him, and happening to be lucky enough to land on a just random assortment of cushions that are out there.
Calvin and Hobbes is exactly the tone, yeah.
Did y'all have anything else you wanted to go over on these two chapters before we dive into the interesting journey of the next two?
Just that I thought it was interesting to see this transition in the Harland household from basically the first winter that Mason and Dixon stay with them. They are treated, with hospitality, but they are treated as essentially as rude guests who are overstaying their welcome every single day they're there. But Mrs. Harland at this point is hugging them and giving them gifts. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a nice change in the dynamic of their relationship.
Yeah.
Okay, so chapter 53. I'll start by saying I absolutely love Cherry Coke's opening here. I think it's stunningly beautifully written. I went back and read it a couple of times just to really take it in. And then it just goes into, whatever chapter 53 is, which is so we talked about this a little bit before recording. About how we want to go about talking about these chapters, because they are, I would argue, for this book, these are the most surreal parts of it. It's wonderfully done. I absolutely enjoyed reading these, and what I tend to do, this is just me personally as a reader, with sections like this, where it's hard to kind of parse out exactly what is happening. I tend to just get to a point where I just kind of want to sit back and enjoy the ride. And I just will go with the flow and just let the narrative take me. And I'll catch, whatever drifts in, I'll grab a hold of it and I'll take it. And that allows me to, when I come back and read it again, to pick up more parts that I didn't get the first time and really build on my my interpretation of it. So I really enjoy chapters like this for that reason, because it is such a shift in the narrative structure and in the plot, but in a good way. It doesn't seem out of place, and it doesn't seem jarring, really. I mean, it is jarring in a sense, but it's not to the point that it makes me want to stop reading the book. If anything, it makes me want to keep going and just see where this happens to go.
Yeah, I will say, before we get any further into any details, I'll say, normally I don't think any of us feel the need to disclaimer spoilers or anything like that on these podcast episodes. First of all, because I think that if you're tuning into a podcast that has chapter titles in the name, you should probably understand that it's something of a book club, and if you haven't read it, then you're probably not going to get a lot out of it. But on the off chance that there's some, I don't know whether you're crazy or a genius, listening to us without having read the book, or at least these chapters so far, go and read chapters 53, 54, and 55 before continuing to listen, because we will dissect the frog in this one. This is I will not say it's a magical series of chapters, but it's pretty damn close, and it's very pleasant to become lost in it and to try and understand what's going on, even if you don't have any success in the matter. But we will sit here and dryly discuss this very cool thing that's about to happen in the book. So go and enjoy it before we kill it.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's an important disclaimer to put on there. You're absolutely right. So, what the hell is going on in these chapters? I think chapter 53 opens with an unnamed woman, at the time unnamed, who is essentially abducted and taken on, I would say, a rather interesting journey.
Yeah, it seems like she's abducted. I don't know if it says specifically where, but somewhere in like eastern or western Pennsylvania, in a small little town, and she's abducted and taken all the way up north to like near Montreal, I imagine, or Quebec City.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a complete change in tone in these chapters to, as you identified before we started recording, Cody, a certain kind of a color, not in a figurative sense. Literally, a bunch of colors are named, which the book is not black and white, but maybe sepia toned before this. And we kind of don't know who the narrator is, because we don't know who any of these characters are. Until the end of chapter 54, we don't get the name of the central character of this part of the book. And we hear as she is kind of in wonder over being abducted from this life that she was very satisfied with. That, in fact, the narrator says, you know, our Lord had intended she live. And she essentially, it turns out that, I don't know if any of us, anyone else felt this way the first time through the book, but when we're at the Redato earlier at Castle Lepton, Casino Lepton maybe, and we hear about Ostra joining the Widows of Christ. I don't know about you all, but I kind of just assumed that was a made-up story by this guy to just kind of fill time. But no, it turns out she has been abducted and is being trained to be a Widow of Christ. And along the way, she's amazed that these quote, wild men aren't violating her, essentially. But when she gets there, she is essentially violated, I would say.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way.
In case nobody remembers, at this point in time, it's been a while since Castle Lepton, but the Widows of Christ seem to be some kind of sect of nuns that we find out in this chapter are being used by the Jesuit order to seduce and control Chinese, I assume, politicians and other people in power in Eastern Asia. And all of this is in pursuit of killing Feng Shui, which a character we are introduced to fairly obliquely in this chapter, the Wolf of Jesus, a Spanish Jesuit priest, explains in a long interrupted monologue that essentially Jesus wants right angles and straight lines, and it's their job as the Society of Jesus to impose this across the world by force if necessary. And it turns out that this Wolf of Christ actually, or this Wolf of Jesus actually doesn't believe in conversion. He believes that if you're not a born Christian, presumably if you're not a born Catholic, that you will never be converted, that you are at some point in time going to turn back into your original faith and be sent to hell anyway. So he kind of sees genocide and conversion of 6 of one, half dozen of the other. I'm gonna say that maybe it would be best if we brush over some of the more specific things that happen in this chapter, because some people have said many times this is a book that you could read to your children. These chapters are basically the only part that is sexually explicit to the degree that it would be unadvisable.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think we want to really talk about those except for in broad terms.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting that it's implied that the women are somehow supposed to occupy both the role of the. I mean, I got the impression that they were supposed to basically be prostitutes in one way or another, and yet they're also being trained to seemingly be missionaries as well. Which is kind of a dichotomy that I found interesting and surprising to think about. I'm not 100% that I'm interpreting that correctly, but I do think that that's in there.
It's definitely kind of a twist on, I forget what they're called, but they're like called black cloisters or something. They're kind of a meme that's happened throughout Western stories since Catholicism has been in control of Europe, and it's just this kind of idea of a cloister where nuns are, except that they are not nuns. They are Satanists who believe that essentially doing sexual things is worshiping Satan. It's often a trope in lascivious material, I'll say.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from with it, Luke, and it's not something I picked up on necessarily while I was reading it, but after you've mentioned it, I'm kind of playing with that idea, and I can absolutely see that connection. And I think that, so we kind of talked about this a little bit again before we started recording, that these last few chapters here are the most, I think, in line, at least in its style with Gravity's Rainbow. And I'm curious if they were written around that time, because it kind of plays with a lot of that. There's a lot of elements of religious dominance and sexual dominance being intertwined, and it has I think Kate and I were talking about this earlier, that there's a kind of Jodorowsky feel to it, like especially if you've seen like Holy Mountain or El Topo, that it has that kind of feel as far as its connection between the religious and the sexual.
Yeah, the acid western, like spirit vision quest type stuff.
Yeah.
One thing I did find somewhat interesting about these chapters and their portrayal of the Jesuit order is that I do believe, and that maybe Brett or one of our listeners who knows more about this kind of stuff can correct me. But I did read on Wikipedia a fair amount about the status of the soldiers for Christ or whatever, the Jesuit order around this time. And I think that around the time that this book is set, around the time these chapters are set, although I guess we're in the Ghastly Fop, so it's unclear when all of this is happening. Anyways, I think this was around the time when Jesuits were getting pretty persecuted in North America, in both Canada and in America. I believe that I read that there was something like only like 20 Jesuit priests in Quebec around this time, because I think they might have banned new Jesuit priests from coming to America and to Canada. So that's not really necessarily in the book as much. I mean, they do kind of seem there is kind of a secretiveness and a kind of like almost intelligence agency type feel to these chapters, which again kind of reminds me of Gravity's Rainbow and the White Visitation and Gravity's Rainbow.
Yeah, in case anybody's unaware, and I believe we've mentioned it in passing before, but the important context for this section is that the Jesuits in North America, up until this point, predominantly provided moral justification for the wars waged by Spanish conquistadors against natives. And so many people, and this is, this would have been profoundly progressive for the time, but somebody like Dixon would have had it in mind constantly, that the Jesuits were to a large extent responsible for those effective genocides. And that the Jesuits, even as early as this, were running schools that were trying to deculture the natives and trying to indoctrinate them with Catholicism. They were running work camps. Oftentimes bishops or priests of local dioceses would be incredibly corrupt across the entirety of North America. So there was good reason for the church to basically respond to this public backlash and say, okay, we will not send Jesuits to North America anymore. And often Jesuits, in pop culture at least, for the purposes of this book, are viewed as kind of the source of rationality in the Catholic Church. And here we see where that lines up with some of the broader themes of the novel, where we have the Wolf of Jesus standing here lecturing on how horrible feng shui is, which, I don't know too much about feng shui, but it seems to me a little deranged to say that basically we should kill whoever we have to in order to erect straight lines to stop this feng shui. And that begins to get into discussions broader in the book about the living earth, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
What are the real motivations here? Is this an excuse? Because it could be an excuse. It could just be that the Jesuits, or at least this Jesuit, says, hey, we want China. We want to be in control of China in some way, shape, or form. Or is it legitimately he just thinks feng shui is Satan worship, and so it must be stopped at all costs? Or is it something more subtle? Is there something demonic about the earth itself? Or is there something demonic about Catholicism itself in the context of this book? And I think that's really the center of those last couple of pages of chapter 53, is to demonstrate the way that the Jesuits are not just acting in North America. And in fact, the paranoia that we've seen throughout the book about Dixon being a Jesuit because of his, Jacobite associations, being a Northerner, and his very vague associations to Le Maire, it all stems from the paranoia of the Jacobite rebellions, and it's very Anglocentric way of viewing the world, when it's clear that the Jesuits don't care about that. The Jesuits do not care about taking over England. Apparently not. Apparently they got bigger fish to fry, like all of China.
I'm glad you brought that up because it really kind of sets, especially if you look at this historically, when it's taking place and the the anti-Asian, but really even more specifically, the anti-Chinese and anti-Japanese sentiment that would kind of filter into America in the centuries after this book takes place.
One thing I find interesting is, and there's the concept of Orientalism, which is, I did study a bit in grad school in a post-colonial class. I kind of wish I still have the textbook for that class, and I kind of wish I had consulted it and reread the section concerning Orientalism. But there is kind of and I do think that this is intentional on Pynchon's part. I'm not accusing him of kind of, like, if I were to accuse a modern writer of Orientalism, it wouldn't, of unconscious, unintentional Orientalism. I wouldn't do it as a compliment, but I do think that Pynchon is kind of commenting on alterity and othering, and how, I think the Jesuits just kind of in that very Christian, very missionary type way of assuming that the Chinese need saving, and that the Chinese practice of feng shui is of the devil and all that stuff. There is a presumption of them being correct, and the so-called native, although we don't usually think of people in China as you don't say the word native and then think of people in China, but I do think that that's in there, the concept of Orientalism and the concept of othering and alterity. Also, I mean, just kind of generally, I do think that it's kind of interesting that the Jesuits are associated with this obsession with straight lines and with kind of arbitrary delineations between different, arbitrary kind of borders and stuff. It's something that I do have a little bit of experience with, traveling as much as I have. The areas that I've been to in Africa, they're not nearly as like the way that the British kind of like drew borders and frontiers in the Middle East, I know has caused a lot of issues. I know that actually I haven't ever been to Rwanda. But if you've seen Hotel Rwanda and you're aware of all that stuff, a big part of the reason that those tragedies happened, those insane, horrible massacres happened, is because of kind of arbitrarily drawn borders that created inequality between different tribes and stuff. It does seem like the British were intentionally trying to piss people off with a lot of the borders they created, in terms of like creating minority, like using the minority, like say the Sunni or Shiite, say the Sunnis are the minority, then they would give the Sunnis power, even though they were the minority in the country. And if they had actually done a good job with borders, then the country would be pretty much only Shiite or only Sunni. This comes up a lot in the discussion of Kurdistan and the modern plight of the Kurds. And it also is a big part of the reason that that tragedy in Rwanda happened. Is these kind of arbitrary, not like the I think Zhang talks about how borders should be drawn along natural boundaries, such as mountains and rivers, things that have always kind of east, like this did come up actually last week too, is east of the Mississippi, west of the Mississippi, east of the Alleghenies, west of the Alleghenies. These these types of things, like mountain ranges and rivers and stuff that were difficult to cross, would have been a kind of bigger deal in the past. Like we don't we don't necessarily like if when you're in Colorado, you don't necessarily think that the other side of the mountains are going to be super different from the side that you're on. But that's because we have highways and we can fly over them and all that stuff. But in the old days, those would be viewed as like very big natural boundaries, very big natural obstacles that would kind of be natural to make borders out of them. I'm kind of rambling, I guess, but I do think that all of that's there. And yeah, especially the Orientalism is interesting to think about, considering that Zhang eventually takes on the form of the Wolf of Jesus, I believe, and starts to look a lot like him and seems to kind of other himself and kind of normalize himself.
Yeah, and I think you rambly or not, I think you're completely correct. I think all of that stuff is in here, and I think the big thing to take note when it comes to discussing the Orientalism in this section is the moment where, jumping ahead just a tad, you have Zhang and Eliza, it turns out, on the road, refugees, and she, I'm going to read on 535, but he is gazing at her with those enigmatic Chinese eyes she pretends she cannot read. And that's salient because, first of all, the whole enigmatic Chinese eyes thing still alive and well today.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond that, this is the point. She's pretending that she sees his eyes as exotic and hard to understand. And in a very direct sense, I think you can read that as saying, this is a pretend. This is not real. Chinese people have magic and do all of this stuff. This is the crazy kind of thing that colonists think about the Chinese at this point in time.
Yeah.
And in fact, he's ascribing a lot of agency to the colonists there. He's not just saying, oh, well, they were stupid, so they thought that Chinese people were different from themselves. What he is saying is specifically, they're choosing not to see them as equals, at least. Or Eliza isn't.
So before we go forward into 54 and 55, I did want to circle back to the mention of colors in these chapters. And you, Will, when you were talking about it earlier, it popped into my head that shift from, as you described it, the kind of sepia tone of the previous 52 chapters up until now, the shift into these particular chapters, it kind of has, it made me think of the Wizard of Oz and that shift from black and white into color. And there's a lot, I picked up on this as I was reading through it, is that there's a lot of mentions, not just of colors, but as you said, very specific colors. And I wanted to kind of touch on those a little bit here, because especially when it comes to, there's mention of roses that comes up later in this chapter that I think is kind of important to the journey that Eliza goes on. But just to kind of point out some of these mentions of colors, so you have there's a brief part here that says, sunsets the colors of the hearth that she may never see. Later on, imagining them all rowing out together into this yellow splendor, these painted indigo and salmon cloud formations. There's just some really beautiful use of color to really get home what we're seeing, the area that we're seeing, the vibrancy of this sort of dream state that we're experiencing. A gray deck of snow clouds, a great green prism of Brazilian tourmaline, which that one I meant to look in more into tourmaline because I figured there was some symbolism in that specifically, especially given the use of rose quartz and oolite earlier on. But then we get on, so page 518, there's a mention of white roses. Have your Indians collected you enough of these white roses that you might spare one? So I went down this kind of rabbit hole looking into the symbology of rose colors, and it's a very real thing, and it has a long history to it. So white roses are supposed to represent new beginnings or farewells. So you can kind of see that as this is Eliza's farewell to the life that she was living, and what she was taken away from. A couple pages later on 520, her gaze inclining to the hothouse rose, deep red, nearly black, whose supple long stem is expertly twisted into a breech clout. And that's being placed on her, as Will said, I don't want to go into too much of the details here because it gets pretty explicit in its content, but so the red rose is representative of beauty, and given the transition that she's now going through, it fits. And then the mention of nearly black. So black roses are meant to represent death. So I'm kind of seeing this as a journey of the killing off of her old self and the formation of this new Eliza, essentially. And I think that comes into play a little bit later. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because on 535, which is in, I want to say it's in chapter 54, but I could be wrong. Yeah, it's in 54. They refer to her as Viudita, which is a way of saying a new or young widow. So she's essentially now completely disconnected from that previous life. And we have a mention. I should have written down the page because we were talking about this before we recorded. But the fact that she talks about her husband and how the person that she sees in this dream she has, I think it was on 529.
Yep.
That she doesn't recognize him as her husband. So it's kind of, I think throughout this whole thing, at least what I picked up on in this reading is, as I mentioned, kind of just flowing through here and letting things catch as they come, is this journey that Eliza goes on through this sort of bizarre religious sexual transition into a wholly new person who is to be utilized by this group who have taken her for whatever purposes they see fit in using her for.
Yeah, and just to be a little more clear, in case somebody read it and didn't understand the red rose for themselves, I think the way I sanitized it was it is an inverse chastity belt.
Yeah,
and we'll leave it at that.
One thing I found interesting about this I was talking about this before we started recording, but it does seem like the frame story, the frame narrative of Wix Cherry Coke telling us this story is the frame narrative, the literary conceit of the frame narrative is kind of dropped in this section. It's not really, and then I think by the end of chapter 55, we're back in the verbal storytelling of Wix Cherry Coke, and Zhang seems to have emerged from the pages of the Ghastly Fop and come into entered the world of the real world of the book, the quote real world end quote of the book, which I did. There's a few different things I wanted to say about that. I did read in the Cambridge Companion to Thomas Pynchon. There's an interesting article on history and what history has meant to the postmodern movement and how the postmodern movement has affected history. And I do think that it's interesting that Pynchon seems to be kind of pointing out how artificial the literary conceit of the frame story is. He also seems to be kind of pointing out that it's, as we've been over with those anachronisms in this book, I don't think that Pynchon is really making a massive effort to be true to life. I think partially because, this book is fairly granular. We get a lot of kind of day-to-day interactions where Mason isn't going to write in his journal, Dixon wore a raccoon or whatever that hat is, the coonskin cap, which I'm not 100% the coonskin cap itself is not also a anachronism. but he basically, Pynchon gets into a lot of stuff that just can't really, we don't really know. And so you can kind of assume that he's making it up. But there's a kind of, you see, Pynchon seems to be kind of pointing out the artificial nature of his narrative. There's an aspect of the people that have studied history as it relates to postmodernism. I think there's a few different aspects of it. I think there's the Cambridge Companion article, which is again about history and Pynchon, points out that there's three aspects of history that have kind of been added by postmodernism. I'm a little bit confused about. I'm blanking on some of them, but one of them is that it's polyvocal, which also comes into play in this one because the writer of the Ghastly Fop seems to kind of take over. I think in either the next section for next week or the section after that, Zhang kind of takes over and tells a story about a Chinese emperor at various times. Like the Le Spark or whatever takes over the narrative for a little bit. But that's emphasizing the fact that one person's perspective on history is not nearly as important as the kind of spectrum of perspectives as a part of postmodernism and its effect on the history and historiography. Another one is just how like the fact that storytelling is a very essential part of documenting history. And to write a history book, to write a history paper, you often have to come up with some sort of narrative, even if it's not necessarily like it's a lot more telling than showing maybe. But the narrative is a very essential part. It has become a very essential part of history. And Pynchon has kind of played his own part in that, and he's also played his own part in pointing out that history should be polyvocal. Yeah, I mean, I just do think it's interesting that it's really unclear who's it's clear that the writer of the Ghastly Fop is the one that's telling us this story, but it's again, up until now, I want to say that pretty much all of the action of the novel in terms of the frame story has all been happening in the dining room, and then we just kind of randomly get stuck up in one of the younger family members' rooms as they're reading the Ghastly Fop with their cousin, and there's not there's no portrayal of them leaving the room with Wick's Cherry Coke. There's no depiction of Wick's Cherry Coke going to sleep. I don't know. It's just interesting to think about, and I don't necessarily have any like really great takeaways for what that's supposed to mean or what it's possibly symbolic of. I don't really think it's necessarily supposed to mean anything or it's supposed to be symbolic of anything besides, like I said, kind of pointing out the artificial nature of what Pynchon is doing.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I need to get that Cambridge. There's a book, right? That's a companion. Yeah, I've been meaning to get that because it looks like it's really got some interesting.
It's really
insight.
good. There's a really good. I read last night. There's a really good article on alterity and othering that focuses a lot on Slothrop and Slothrop's like fragmentation as a character and how he kind of others himself and kind of becomes. I don't know. It was really interesting. It focuses a lot on Gravity's Rainbow and a little bit on Lot 49, and does kind of ignores the rest of Pynchon's work. But it's one of the it's probably my favorite piece of criticism I've come across about Pynchon is that article about alterity and othering.
So this is one of my favorite dumb parts of not dumb parts, but one of my favorite things to do when I'm reading Pynchon. It is pretty dumb. The fractions of 1/2, 2/3, and 3/4 often tend to be pretty structurally important to his works. And this section lays just across the 2/3 mark of Mason and Dixon. And it's not quite centered, but it roughly is centered that we leave the Cherry Coke frame narrative. We leave the parlor entirely and are trapped inside this book, inside another room. And then, strangely, towards the end of chapter 54, it actually melds back into Cherry Coke's perspective. It does distinctly leave his perspective for chapter 53, and then for the first half of 54, it is primarily first person singular from the point of view of Eliza. But then after we have a brief resituating in the room where Ethelmer and Tenebrae are doing some of their most direct flirting in the book, it returns to her first person perspective until just randomly it switches over back to the parlor room and the other uncles, or the other listeners and uncles, just commenting on the story as though these are the same story, as though one of these wasn't extemporaneously told by Wix Cherry Coke and the other weren't published as a serial that seems to date back to the time of Mason and Dixon surveying the line. It is naughty. It is incredibly dense, and I can't quite extricate it all. And I think I mentioned last episode my harebrained theories about ampersands.
I was just about to bring that back up.
But something that is discussed a lot when you look up Against the Day, and this is not a spoiler for Against the Day in any way, but if you look up on Google Scholar Against the Day, one thing that's quite often pointed out is that you can frame it as a Mobius strip, in a way that to explain would require spoilers. However, Mason and Dixon, which I read long before Against the Day or ever heard that theory, I feel does exemplify that to a large extent, because there is this inversion of the story itself, or almost more of a Klein bottle, where the inside of the story, this story inside the story, becomes the frame narrative in which we are actually reading the rest of the story, which is a frame narrative which contains the form, the whatever the name is, the kidnappers, or the kidnapped tale. It really is non-orientable as a novel as a result of these two chapters. There is no outside. There is no truth here. There is no reality, because Eliza, the captor, or the captive, and Zhang, who helps her escape, run back into Mason and Dixon. And, well, the stories completely converge, despite the fact that they have no context for one another. Despite the fact that, I guess theoretically, Wix Cherry Coke could have been writing the Ghastly Fop this whole time. Or
he could have written an unofficial forgery or whatever.
Yeah, he could have been just a massive fan and has been ripping it off the whole time, and Ethelmer has just been missing it, or he just hadn't gotten to the point yet, because this does converge at this point with the Ghastly Fop does converge with the Mason and Dixon story at this point in time. But yeah, it's I've turned this over and over in my head for hours. I'm confident over the course of years at this point. And I don't think it's resolvable. There is no solution to this. This is not a puzzle box. This is not something to be sussed out. This is just essentially an MC Escher painting in text form. This whole book.
I think, and especially this part too, yeah, with the fact that we're in a different book, and then that book is then folded into the main book and all that stuff. It definitely kind of is reminiscent of that kind of thing, where it's like all these links and staircases to different things that don't really make sense, but they still happen.
So the last, I guess, kind of major thing I want to touch on regarding these chapters is it kind of goes back to, because so much of these 3 chapters kind of circle back into itself. Is the, as we mentioned earlier, the conflict between the wolf of Jesus and the portrayal, I guess, or the idea of feng shui, and how that it kind of feeds into the overall narrative and the concept of borders. And I know y'all brought this up earlier, about the idea of the natural border versus the man-made border. And, that's really shown through, the wolf of Jesus and his want for these, angular lines of delineation and distinction, and Zhang's desire for a more natural, free-flowing border, if even there is a border at all, if there has to be one, to have it that way. Because with feng shui, and I don't know too much about it, but I did look a little bit into it just for to get some insight on these particular chapters. And so it's interesting that this is so, because that whole concept of feng shui, I think, is very important to what Pynchon's trying to get, in really how, placing these borders, these arbitrary borders on the land. We've talked about before how, it has these impacts, these scars upon the earth. As it's mentioned later on, Zhang talks about how it's the wolf of Jesus is his destiny to inflict these telluric injuries, as it is mine to resist them. And it's I'm trying to think of how to really articulate this, but I think it's really being emphasized here that our desire, our drive to place these borders, to inflict these scars on the land, is essentially the cause of this evilness that is felt throughout the book. And we get another mention I think was interesting at the very beginning of chapter 55 of that kind of evil wind that was present on Saint Helena. Where it says, imagine a wind, a truly ill wind, bringing failure, poverty, disgrace, betrayal, every kind of bad luck there is, all blowing through, night and day, with many times the force of the worst storm you were ever in. And I looked a little bit into the Luopan that's mentioned throughout that Zhang uses, and it was pretty interesting. I don't want to try to, provide too much because I'm not in any way any kind of an expert on it, but it's really interesting, especially on 544, when we see this kind of dichotomy between how Dixon and Zhang use compasses, and their purpose in doing it, and that kind of all, I'm getting way off track here, but it's, I think this idea of feng shui versus this angular distinction in borders is a hugely important part of not just these chapters, but really of this whole book.
Interesting that it's a Catholic character that's saying this. It does kind of there is kind of an artificiality to the Catholic Church. I've been to mass a few times just with friends whenever I was growing up. I don't have a ton of experience with the Catholic Church, but they wear all these fancy robes, as opposed to like Buddhism, where there's not, there's no real barriers between you and, enlightenment, or, Buddhism seems kind of a lot more DIY, which is probably a regressive way to phrase that. But, I think you get what I'm saying. There's not really a concept of a higher power, I think, in Buddhism, or there's not nearly as much of one. But a big part of Catholicism is, if you have questions, it's not like figure it out yourself. It's not like read the Bible. It's ask a priest. They do all this stuff where they choose the Pope, and the Pope wears all these different costumes. I think people kind of maybe innately get what I'm getting at here, where there's just kind of an artificiality to the church, and a kind of, I think it's called high church as opposed to, I'm not sure what that's opposed to, but It has a lot of kind of the trappings of kind of it's highfalutin, I guess, or at least it tries to be, which I do think is perhaps maybe a part of the inspiration for why the Jesuits are portrayed as liking, the artificial nature of straight lines across a landscape that doesn't necessarily demand a straight line boundary. I kind of wish I had a little bit more to say about that, because I do think it's an interesting point, but I don't necessarily know how to phrase it further. So I'm just kind of struggling. I don't. It's interesting to me that it's a Jesuit character. It's the fact that he's specifically a Catholic priest is just interesting to me. I mean, like as we've been over, the Jesuits were not popular in England, and so much of this book, especially in the subtext, and it's kind of hiding behind a lot of the different actions and the different kind of more serious aspects of this book, is kind of how shitty the British were, how shitty colonization is, how colonization can kind of have a lot of negative effects, or almost all negative effects and very few positives. And it's just kind of interesting to me that he chooses to put that opinion and like the person has such an intense opinion about it, in the mouth of a Jesuit. So I would, if I were writing this novel, or if somebody had told me that somebody in Mason and Dixon, and I had some knowledge about the book, somebody had told me that somebody in Mason and Dixon had strong opinions about there should be like straight lines across the landscape, I wouldn't necessarily assume that it'd be a Jesuit that'd be saying it. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
I would assume it'd be some type of British official or something like that. So I'm just kind of trying to verbally investigate why that opinion is linked to the Catholic Church.
Yeah, so there's one other thing that the Jesuits are most strongly associated with that I just barely touched on earlier, and that is education. And in a lot of ways, you can frame education as a system of control. And throughout all of your conversation, or I guess your thinking there, Luke, what came to my mind was the idea that essentially the Catholic Church in this time period has just come out of pretty much the biggest drop off in power that any single organization that didn't immediately collapse has ever experienced. From like the year 1300 to 1700 in Europe, the Catholic Church went from, sure, there were Orthodox Catholics who didn't respect the Roman Church very much, or the Roman Pope very much, but they had very similar fundamental beliefs, to something that really the modern nation state paradigm, the conception of the world as people make up nations and people have religions, rather than the old chain of being kind of framing of there's God and he talks to priests, and below the priests are the rest of us humans, and below the humans are the animals, and below the animals are the plants, and so on and so forth. It really is a massive identity crisis for hundreds of years for the Catholic Church. And what you can frame this as is in the same way that earlier, which we barely touched on it, because this is just such a dense part of the book, and I apologize to listeners, Dixon's fear of open spaces kind of ties into that. He's afraid of these wide open spaces, not because it's a lack of straight lines, but because it's anyone could come from anywhere. Something could pop out from any corner, well, non-corner, from behind any bush or tree. And in this context, the Jesuits, as the intellectual, cognitive side of the Catholic Church, are probably going to be, and I don't know historically this at all, if this is accurate, but especially since they were involved in early colonization efforts in North America and internationally, they are used to having power. This is power he's searching for. Whether or not there is some metaphysical fight going on, whether or not feng shui is satanic, this is a fight for control by the Catholic Church, or at least the Jesuit society, or at least this crazy wolf of Jesus, to control everything.
So, really, I think we've covered most of what's going on in here in these, especially these last 3 chapters. I did want to bring up, and I know I bring this up pretty often, but I think it really hit a lot harder here. So there's obviously been connections throughout this book to Against the Day. This one, though, there's one on page 548 that I think was the most direct we've had at this point, where I'll just read it's a shortish paragraph. Most unhappy, recalls Mr. Everybeat. Not at all the paradise one has been led to expect. Lead out here is a much needed metal. Who controls lead controls a supply of ammunition for all sides in every dispute, not to mention a segment of the telluric energy market. Stellaron's lead plates may indeed have been but the visible calibrating devices for a much more extensive engine below, perhaps an array of them, and a city to surround that. A Plutonian history unfolding far below our feet, all unknown to us above, but for occasional volcanoes and earth tremors. A completely large, unsensed world, held within our own light, like a child in a womb, waiting for some summons to light. For anyone who has read Against the Day, like that reads so much to the scene where the Chums of Chance travel to the South Pole and enter into the Earth, which is found to be essentially a hollow Earth, wherein there's a society of gnomes. And what I really thought was interesting was this also ties into the Luopan that Zhang uses, because when I was looking into that, so it's a compass that's used for feng shui, but it orients to the South Pole rather than most compasses that we're familiar with that orient to the North Pole. So I thought that was a really interesting connection to that story, especially it being that explicit to the plot of both stories. So I just thought that was a really interesting, pretty direct connection to those two.
Yeah, definitely.
And that does there is, I think it's coming up pretty quick, the part where Dixon, maybe it's in like 100 pages, maybe it's not that quick, but the part where Dixon, this is a bit of a spoiler, I guess, but Dixon having an experience with the Hollow Earth and with journeying into the Earth from the, I think, North Pole, which is, a thing, and it's a short section of Against the Day where that happens with the Chums of Chance, but it's definitely a super memorable part of Against the Day. I actually didn't know that about the compass orienting to the South Pole. I have actually been to Antarctica. I went with my grandma about 15 years ago. And Antarctica does come up some in Pynchon's work, and some in a few other authors' works that I like, such as Lovecraft. Yeah, I kind of forget. I don't think Antarctica comes up in Mason and Dixon. I think the focus, if it's on one of the two polar regions, it's mostly on the North Pole. But it's interesting that is an aspect of feng shui that I didn't necessarily pick up on.
Definitely.
One thing I found interesting about I know we've kind of intentionally avoided the more explicit parts of these chapters, which I think is a good thing. It does kind of make me wonder how we're going to handle Gravity's Rainbow, which is ultra sexual in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I'd feel less bad about somebody going into a Gravity's Rainbow podcast being exposed to some of those things.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying.
That's true.
Yeah.
I think you kind of know what you're getting into with that.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
But I did find it interesting that yin and yang or seem to be linked by Zhang to sex and to the, like romance between a man and a woman. I just kind of perused the Wikipedia page for yin and yang, and there is a mention of sex in terms of gender. But I've, besides like some kind of, I don't like, besides like the position 69, I haven't ever seen yin and yang ever really related to sex. I was kind of surprised that the Chinese character linked yin and yang to sex, because it's such a spiritual concept to me, at least. I don't know. I was interested in that. I didn't necessarily know where Pynchon was getting that from. It could actually, it's occurring to me that could be an example of Orientalism, and like the writer of the Ghastly Fop. Most likely, in the world of this book, I highly doubt that whoever the writer is, even if it's Cherry Coke or if it's another author or storyteller, there's very little chance that they have any direct experience with China.
Will, did you have anything else that you wanted to touch on?
Yes, but I've forgotten that already. But Luke, my understanding, and I am not an expert in any way, shape, or form, but for the purposes of conversation, yin and yang. My understanding of qi and sha and these kinds of things, and this side of Asian culture, is that there is this sharp divide broadly, and big generalizations. There is, historically in China at least, this sharp divide between public and private life, and idiomatically there's the idea of Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching, for personal things, and Confucius, the Analects for private life. And Taoism is very sexual. Taoism has a lot of sex mysticism. It is related to Hinduism in those ways. Maybe not, in a genealogical sense, but in terms of the kind of vibe. Sexuality is viewed as spiritual in that realm, in Taoism, and that Taoism is a source of a lot of those the more mystical sides of Buddhism.
Yeah, I wasn't necessarily aware of that, so that's good information. I've always found it interesting and super hard to parse. Like it's one of the most difficult concepts that I've really come across ever in my life, is kind of the interrelation between different Asian religions, and especially Buddhism and Hinduism, and how in some ways they're the same religion, and in some ways they correlate a lot, and they're different in other ways. Because like, I don't, with Abrahamic religions, it does seem to be kind of, it's a lot easier to kind of tell them apart, and to kind of understand the relations between them, mostly because I grew up in a Western country. I think you get what I'm saying. Like, it's super hard to kind of figure out the relationship between all these different Asian philosophies / religions.
Absolutely, and it doesn't help things at all, the fact that we are using terms like Hinduism, Buddhism, which, broadly you can carve out a category called Buddhism, but whether you include Buddhism in the category of Hinduism is a complete matter of judgment. Some Buddhists say you can put it inside Hinduism. Some Hindus say you can put Buddhism inside Hinduism. Some say they are not related at all, despite the clear, direct lineage between the two of them. And not to mention the fact that, within Buddhism, you have these two big schools of Theravada and Mahayana, one of which doesn't believe the other to be valid, and the other which believes that both are considered Buddhism. And within each of those branches, you have these tiny little sects that are founded on folk religions that are local to individual locales. And it is, from our perspective, very hard to begin learning anything reliable. It is so crazy.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't help that there's a seemingly endless amount of relevant writing to Buddhism, Hinduism, all these different forms of Eastern religion. Whereas, like the Christianity has the Bible, and maybe, it's that's what's canonical, and then there's other people that are kind of, like St. Augustine doesn't have like some kind of like denomination devoted to him, like C.S. Lewis doesn't have a sect of Christians that believe he is the second coming of Jesus and stuff like that. Like it's with Buddhism and Hinduism, it seems like it's kind of an endless amount of like what in Western religion, what in Christianity is called denominations.
Yeah, and that goes back to our earlier discussion of Catholicism as a method of control, because the reason you have such a lack of diversity in North American religions is due to an active attempt to squash out smaller minority religions by the Catholic Church. And that's why, sects like Mandaeism and Manichaeanism are so far from what any other Christian, and whether they are Christian sects is an incredibly violent topic. Not lately, but historically. We do have this interculturalism contrasted against this very specific form of belief in the context of Jesuits, not just Catholics, but a particularly casuarist, I think is the phrase, form of Christianity. The entirely focused on reason, which really does epitomize the central theme of a lot of Pynchon's writings. What do either of you have a strong interpretation of Captain Zhang's transformation into a doppelganger?
Yeah, I do think it kind of it is interesting that he turns into his enemy, the person that's pursuing him across North America, or at least the northern part of North America. It definitely kind of brings to mind some other kind of Pynchon. Like for some reason, it reminds me of Vineland and I think it's Bond or Bond. I think it's Bond who is in some ways depicted as very different from people like Zoid. But I do think that there's kind of, it's the blurring of the line between good and evil. Like the fact that people that, with some exceptions, I would say, but people that are viewed as completely evil probably aren't as completely evil as it's said. And people that are viewed as saintly and super good people are probably more evil than they or other people want to admit, if that makes sense. Like it seems to kind of speak to the fact that the line between a good and a bad person is a lot more blurred than people want to think, which is kind of a very Pynchon thing to believe. Pynchon doesn't seem to think that anyone or anything is completely correct. I feel like Pynchon is the type of person that enjoys poking holes in things that even he believes and the things that other people believe. And kind of he's very, I feel like I would use the word like relativistic to describe Pynchon, and subjective perhaps too.
Yeah, I was just gonna say there are definitely shades of like Scarsdale vibe and Bond and even Blicero in this character of the Wolf of Jesus.
Yeah, I kind of took Zhang's adoption of the Wolf of Jesus's persona, well, not so much persona, but physical appearance, really, is kind of a one of the, the to know your enemy, you have to become your enemy kind of thing, and it's kind of alluded to, I think, later on that he's kind of losing his mind, but I think there's also an argument to be made that he's being very cunning in what he's doing and getting inside the mindset of the person who is tracking him and who he's trying to take down. And by becoming that person, he is able to understand what his moves might be, so that he can anticipate whatever might come his way and have a plan for it.
Yeah, I think it. At this point, I guess I'll bring up the fact that this is one of the funniest parts of the book to me, is the fact, not the part of the book, I guess, but the fact that it's in the book, a scene where essentially a tertiary character comes up to the main characters of the book and says, "You are not the main characters of the story." It's deeply funny. But that also does mean that we don't know everything that Zhang knows. Maybe this is a completely rational thing to do. Maybe this isn't crazy in the least. Maybe it is a cold, calculated form of like opposition research, like you're saying.
And I do think it's interesting that, as I think I pointed this out, I think it was me, maybe it was someone else in a past episode of the podcast, is that, like the further you get into this book, the more the central narrative gets kind of fractured, and the more that other voices start taking over for Cherry Coke, that's also true for Gravity Rainbow especially, but a few other mentioned novels, where you think it's going one way and you think it's going to be a lot more straightforward than it ends up being.
I do also love that in all of this kind of serious talk of Zhang and his attempts to bring down the Wolf of Jesus and everything he's doing, he essentially turns the whole thing into like a pay-per-view wrestling event.
Yes,
where he says,
That's
by the time
exactly
he finally arrives in this camp, announces Captain Zhang, "No one will be able to tell which is the real Zarpazo. We two will meet then in a struggle to the death, witnessed by all. The axemen will place bets. There will be beer and Dutch pretzels, a bottomless urn of coffee. Depending on how long the contest takes, perhaps a free luncheon as well." Like, just undercuts the seriousness of everything that he's done up to this point, and just turns it into, hey, hell, there will be a deli tray and drinks and everything. It'll be a good time.
Yeah, it feels like if in the middle of standing in the ring, like flashback to the 80s, Hulk Hogan is standing there flexing, having won his last bout, and he stops halfway through to say, "And we have very comfortable seats."
And Pizza Hut will bring pizza for us all.
Beer only $2.
The only other thing I wanted to get y'all's opinion on, I mean, we could talk about these chapters forever. And I don't know, I may be about to say something that's going to not make any sense to anyone listening to this, and I may be dating myself even more than I have in the past, and I'm not old enough to really have been around for this, but the character Zuza, does that seem like a direct reference to Zsa Zsa Gabor to anyone else?
I don't know about direct, but yeah, absolutely. That's where my mind went.
The kind of the way she's portrayed, the very un-English way of saying things she has, and the kind of just movie star beautiful that she is. That's just immediately where my mind went. And as soon as I thought that, I was like, Jesus, no one else is going to remember who Zsa Zsa Gabor was.
Yeah, I wanted to get y'all's opinion on that side of things, where it is clear that, it's made clear to us that Eliza is at least believes herself to be happy in her first home. And then we're kind of made to believe that while she's not anywhere near as happy with the situation as Astra seems to have been, she appears to be fairly okay with things in with the Viudas for a moment at least. But she at this moment, or not at this moment, but she has gone this whole journey with Zhang, and she, from her perspective, does seem to be interested in him, not just afraid, not just like afraid of him making an advance on her, but genuinely does seem interested in him, does seem to care for him, and immediately upon meeting the party, teams up with this Zsa Zsa Gabor type and sets off for an adventure with some pretty lesbian overtones. It's just an interesting decision there, and you have to wonder what's going through Zheng's head this whole time, because he's trying to get a hold of her before she is made into a viuda de Cristo. But it we're not sure why, because he doesn't ever make an advance on her, and if anything, it makes advances on him. I don't know, it's all very strange to me.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that. I don't really know particularly what was going on between them.
Well, and then the last thing I have, like you said, we could talk about this forever. There are so many things we skipped over, like the whole wig thing, the skulls in the wig room. Like, dear Lord, that's so full of meaning. But I mean, every page, like seriously, I thought about rewriting the summary today, and I realized that spending a sentence on every page would take. I mean, that would be brushing over everything essentially.
So I mean, this would have to be a 6-hour episode to really get into all of it.
Yeah, and we will we'll revisit a lot of these things when we get to the end of the America section and at the end of the book. Don't worry, listeners. But the last thing for now, I guess, that I had in mind was this strange moment where Zhang has pretty much lost it, and he says to assuage people who are saying, "Hey, wait a second, you're telling us that there's this genocidal maniac priest en route here, and you want to fight him around all of us, where we have our families, we have our lives here? What is this about?" And he says, "You're safe as long as I have a cyst from a cobra's head." And then he doesn't say anything else, and I don't believe it's brought up in the rest of the book. So it reminds me of, again, Against the Day, during the Chums of Chance sections, the ways that Pynchon would refer to other volumes, where it just seems like we are supposed to have read Captain Zhang earlier in the Ghastly Fop and understand the value of this Cobra cyst. But as it stands, it's just here. And he makes this big deal out of it, and all that we get is a punchline where Dixon says, "I would like to purchase one of these apparently useless objects."
Yeah, I caught on to that too, and I went to the wiki to look for it, and there's 2 links about it, one of which is broken, and the other is it's to a page on Vasuki, who is the second king of Nagas in Hinduism. But there's really nothing on that page about the Cobra cyst thing. So I meant to go more into that and see what the significance of that was, but I just did not get around to it.
I did just Google Cobra cyst, which I'm now figuring out was, in terms of gore, is maybe not the smartest thing to Google, but
yeah.
I guess that there's a type. I think cyst can be described as looking like a cobra head. I think that's a type of cyst.
Oh,
interesting.
So maybe there's something there with that. I don't. I'm kind of scared of poisonous snakes. I don't know a lot about them. it did kind of occur to me that I don't know, the relation, like, the fact that it's described as like a pearl or something. I don't, you don't necessarily link the word cis to something like a pearl. I found that part really interesting, but I didn't necessarily understand it.
I am now reading a wiki article, not a Wikipedia article, a wiki article about radiology reading.
Interesting.
So thank you for that, Lou. It doesn't seem terribly relevant.
So if it means anything, the broken link that's on the Pension Wiki was trying to go to occultmansion.com. So it may have some occult tie to it.
Yeah, the pineal gland did come up in my Google search as well, which would be related to the third eye concept and all that.
Yeah.
Brad, if you know anything, or listeners, if you know anything about that, I think all of us would love to know what is going on with that. Because that one really grabbed my attention as well.
So before we get into the end game of this, I did want to bring up that for our episode last week, I talked about some of my college experiences as they relate to Nath's letter. I think in chapter 46. I don't. There's something about it when I was listening to the episode. There's something about it that reminded me of Pynchon's friendship with Richard Farina. It did kind of strike me that some parts of that letter seem to be a bit random or kind of smashed together, or written in a kind of, maybe not a shorthand, but in a very overly familiar way. And I did kind of wonder if perhaps Pynchon, if one of my friends had died soon after college in a tragic motorcycle accident, let alone the possible conspiratorial aspects of his death, but I would probably, especially in that time period, I would hold the letters that him and I had exchanged pretty close. But it did kind of strike me as perhaps like maybe Pynchon was quoting himself in his letters, or quoting Farina in his letters from that time. I mean, that's just, it's something that we'll never know for sure. Maybe perhaps we'll know through the Pynchon dumping all of his writing documents on that library in California. But I don't know, it just kind of struck me as like, it was a fun, like, kind of headcanon thing for me that is it's kind of an oblique reference to him and Farina, which that's from last week, but I don't know.
I hadn't thought about that, but that's you got me thinking on that now.
Yeah, when I read this book, I really do see a lot of. I think it's hard for me to see this book as anything other than centered on friendship, and particularly male friendship.
Mm-hmm.
And it really, I read this before I knew anything about Pynchon, and when I learned that his best friend had died, when they were like 26, I mean, it all kind of made sense there.
Yeah, now I'm curious if maybe that the loss of that friend was the impetus to start a book like this, because by the end of it, that's where we end up, is with one friend mourning the loss of another.
Yeah, that is true. That's kind of, I didn't necessarily link it to the genesis of this book, but that would make sense.
Well, should we lighten the mood with some humor?
Let's.
So I mean, we started with the prank war between the two of them, and Mason's not so great attempt at doing pranks. I did like, just as a brief thing, the fact that Mason has a service grade beaver hat that he wears. I just thought that was an amusing description for that hat.
Yeah.
I found what I may be digging too much into, but what I think might be two more, because this would not be the first time. Monty Python and the Holy Grail references or nods, as they were. The first being on page 494 when they're talking about the black dog. Just the way it reads, careful, warns Mr. Barnes, you're not supposed to use any of its names, really. Really? The black dog? Can't say the black shh. 'Tis one of the things that are never said. It totally reads like a Knights of Knee moment where you're not supposed to say certain words.
Definitely.
And then the other was, what page was it on? 507. The line, Mason, he cried, though Mason, who was in fact not doing too much better, lay snoring in a corner. She had it all, beauty, money, whatever else there is. That brought to mind the, what's not to like about her? She's beautiful, she's rich, she's got huge tracts of land. So, yeah, those were my two little Monty Python moments.
Yeah, I had a couple as well. I mean, I growing up, me and my little brother, who's just a year younger, both had coonskin caps that I believe we got from when we were in Texas and maybe at the Alamo, because Davy Crockett used to wear those, I want to say. And just the whole thing about, him thinking that Dixon's a werewolf, or him thinking that it's like his actual hair, is really funny. I mean, the ones that I had were like pretty obviously fake, and all of that. I'm sure that if they were real coonskin, it would be a little bit different in terms of how they had been received. And I don't necessarily know how funny it is. It just kind of reminded me of funny stuff. The part I can't remember what character sleeps with their eyes open.
It was Mason.
Okay, yeah, because I have a family friend who. Family friends who have a son who's a little bit older than me, and I remember this was years ago, but I went over to their house with my family, and then we got on the subject of him sleeping with his eyes open, and they had like they showed me like 30-40 pictures of him sleeping with his eyes open, and it's just it just made me laugh. Like, if you've ever seen somebody sleep with their eyes open, which I've never seen with my own eyes, I've seen pictures of it. It's a really
wild.
It's absurd, yeah. It's super absurd. It's really funny. It's kind of scary in a lot of ways.
It is.
Yeah.
It really is. I used to go hunting with my dad, and one of his friends did that, and I didn't know what it was at the time because I was like 10, maybe 9. I thought he died. Like, it did not track in my mind that was something that a person could physically do.
Yeah, my sister growing up, I don't know if she still does it, but she used to sleep with her eyes open. And I will tell you, once you get used to it, it is an excellent way to set a prank for somebody else. Because you can really scare the crap out of somebody by your sister or whoever it is falling asleep. If they're a heavy sleeper, you can kind of pose them, put stuff on them. Really trick other people into thinking they're awake.
Will, did you have any particular funny scenes that you wanted to bring up?
I did, and I just can't find it or remember it. So give me I'm gonna go through one more quick time.
I will say I did also like the fact that Cherry Coke got dunked on again when they got brought up.
Oh, that whole thing about like Mason insulting him and then saying that he's like respectable or whatever.
Yeah, well, somebody asked, I don't remember who it was asked if there was a chaplain in the party, and the answer was regrettably yes. I tried never to seek his counsel.
Yeah, that was Eliza.
Yeah, and then it shifts to Cherry Coke talking about that. So he's actively admitting to all of these people disliking him.
Yeah, that's definitely part of this, is that Cherry Coke wants to be disliked by most people, it seems.
Yeah, like he just revels in it.
All right, I'm giving up.
Okay.
Give me one second to find my second choice thing again. Oh, yes. Okay, finally. Sorry about that. It's on page 530. Something we haven't mentioned yet is that there is a moment where the Wolf of Jesus realizes that Zhang speaks Spanish, and so in some sense he's been a spy. which, you know, is obvious to us later on, but, you know, this is news to him and us. And it's followed by he saying, the Spaniard is intending to, rather than just kill Zhang, perhaps keep him useful. You know, just see if he can be convinced to forget. And it's phrased, to any mind at all inquisitorial and an appealing turn of fate. Yet the Spaniard is disappointed, soon bitterly so, at Zhang's willingness cheerfully to forget all he may have learned, to recite whatever catechism of the past the Spaniard prefers. And I love that, because there is this horrible buildup in just the paragraph prior where you realize, oh crap, Zhang is in danger. This character who we barely know at that moment, but you know him well enough to be like, oh crap, this guy is the Wolf of Jesus is a bad guy. He's trying to kill Zhang. Zhang must be a good guy. And then no, Zhang is just willing to roll over and do whatever the hell he wants, or at least pretends to.
Yeah, there's so much of these chapters that we could have just kept going over. I forgot. I had totally forgotten about that.
There is so much in these chapters.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to quotes and see if Luke or I can steal Will's thunder this week. Because I think the last 2 weeks we haven't been able to. So.
Yeah. Good luck.
We'll see. Luke, you want to go first?
Yeah, so my favorite quote is the beginning of chapter 55. Terrible feng shui here. Worst I ever saw. You two crazy. And then Dixon talks and tries to make Zhang look at the visto that's sweeping them away. And then Zhang says it acts as a conduit for what we call Sha, or as they say in Spanish, California, bad energy. That's just as we've been over in this podcast, you know, Pynchon's obsession with the 60s, Pynchon's connections to the 60s. It's just a very, you know, Pynchon lived in California, I think, before marrying his wife and moving to New York, I think in the early 80s. It's at least theorized. But yeah, that just struck me as a very, I love that quote. And I did actually look up the whole Spanish California thing. That would be a bit of an anachronism for the time period of them drawing the line, but not for Cherrycoke telling the story. Because I think that the Spanish first established settlements or forts in California in like 1769 and 1770. And I believe we're still kind of near the middle of the decade of the 1760s.
Yeah.
In the drawing of the line. It's also just kind of funny to me that a Chinese guy who's on the east side of North America would even know that Spanish California exists. But I don't know, I just really like that quote.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. Mine's on page 551. Almost towards the end of the chapter 55. And it says, they submit, Sousa replies, to the preemptive needs of the maneuver. A soldier's faith at last must rest in the impurity of his desires. What can a Hansel possibly wish for that Heinz in front of him and Dieter behind, and a couple of Fritzes on either side have not already desired? Multiplied by all the ranks and files, stretching away across the plain. The same blonde from down the street, the same pot of beer, the same sack of gold delivered by some elf for doing nothing. Who is unique? Who is not owned by someone? What do any of their desires matter if they can be of no use to the maneuver, where all is timed from a single pulse, each understanding no more than he must? I think it, again, kind of goes back to that Gravity's Rainbow era of his writing, and that idea that, you know, especially in when you're looking at warfare and how, you know, all these people who are brought in as soldiers basically become, I don't want to say dehumanized, but they're basically just kind of made into the same person almost, and they kind of lose that identity that defines them as an individual, and strips away their uniqueness and just puts them, you know, another person in line marching to the beat of the drum.
Yeah, I myself, I always find the best characterization, at least in Pynchon, you know. It may be due to the lack of characterization, you know, some may say. is in those tiny little those crevices, right? The implications.
Mm-hmm.
This is a great example. So part of me would like to cheat and basically say, like, the first half of chapter 53. But that's way too long. I can't even convince myself that that's fair. And a lot of the stuff that we have intentionally not discussed, not not so much the other sections, although there are a few of those sections, but some of the stuff we've intentionally not discussed is some of the most beautiful writing in this book, and it has some incredibly powerful symbolism, and I highly recommend everybody savor these passages if you just skimmed over them. But I'm going to go with a section that we did not intentionally skip over. Right at the end of chapter 54, Rebecca's ghost returns to Mason for just a moment, essentially. Rebecca, her eyelids never blinking, for where all is dust, dust shall be no more, confronts him upon surfaces not so much random as outlaw, uncontrolled by any apparent end or purpose in the penumbra of God's concern. That's if you don't mind comparing his regard with a solar eclipse. Moving water. Mason tries to go fishing whenever he can, for there is no telling what the next ripple may present him. The rock abysses and mountainsides, leaves in the wind announcing a storm, shadows of wrought ironwork upon a wall, the kissing crusts of new-baked loaves. On the Indian warrior paths, to and from triumphs, captivities and death, in the lanes overgrown of abandoned villages at the turn of the day, in the rusted ending of the sky's light, in the full eye of the wind, she stands, waiting to speak to him. What more has she to say? He has long run out of replies. Then I am not she, but a representation. This thing, she will not style it death. I am detained here, in this thing, that my body all the while was capable of, and leading me to, and carried with it surely as the other thing, the thing our bodies could do together. She will not style it love. Has she forgotten words over there where tongues are stilled and no need for either exists? And I haven't fully processed this section. I do think there is a lot of genuine meaning in it. Not it's not the densest section of the book at all, but I think there is a lot of what Pynchon believes about humanity in this. But it is just beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Just sonically and on the page. I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, that is a absolutely beautiful end to that chapter. Well, what's our most Pynchon part? I think it's obviously chapters 53 through 55, but I don't know if y'all had any other parts.
Mine was what we've already discussed is Zhang slowly turning into, which I think I already probably said is very Pynchon-esque, but Zhang slowly turning into the Wolf of Jesus. That's the kind of thing that only Pynchon, or perhaps an author influenced by Pynchon, or one of Pynchon's influences, would really dare to do.
Yeah, if I have to point at a particular thing, I think it's either just the choice of this section has 2, which makes 4 or 5 references to werewolves, none of which are actual werewolves as we think of them today. Yeah. All of them are like either metaphorical werewolves or a pun, like a dog person, or like Zhang, he's just Lobo. It's a nickname. But within the really mind-bending part, I guess, I think it is just the most Pynchon thing in the world to have a tertiary character come in and just tell the main characters that they are side characters.
Yeah,
I think that's hilarious. Especially when, to the side characters are, eponymous to the title, and also like actual like historical figures whereas Zhang is entirely fictional. I hope. I dearly hope.
All right, well, let's go on to our weekly email from Brett. We technically got two because I did email him in the middle of the week to ask about the cave. So that was our first one, but then he did also send our usual episode wrap up notes. And he said, hey all, this week's thoughts. Glad you mentioned Darby and Cope as historical members of the survey party. Often when Pynchon invokes a party member, there are historical records mentioning that person. The McLeans, for example, were a major surveying family. Moses was a steward of the party. Samuel, Alexander, and Archibald were involved in efforts to survey the 12-mile circle around Newcastle, Delaware. Interesting, Nath McLean appears a Pynchon invention. I find no mention of that name in the record. Nath is such a fascinating character, so I find his relationship to the history interesting. On coffee. It's associated with revolutionary sentiment. It's a global product, one requiring the input of enslaved labor, and it's shown as fueling the politics of the day. Iron Hill is real. It's near Newark, Delaware. Iron deposits there were mined throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, often by underclass workers, including freed slaves. The wedge is generally depicted as a magical space, unbounded and outside the Enlightenment order, because its geometry is so idiosyncratic, but it is only a temporary magic. The boundary dispute involving the wedge will be resolved in the 1920s, bringing the space into, quote, civilized maps. Will's excellent quote choice and the ensuing discussion touch on this wonderfully. I thought the discussion of Peter Redzinger and Gnosticism was thoughtful and insightful. Excellent work there. Also loved the depth of Kate's engagement with the journal. It's so great to give space to that document, which is fascinating both on its face and as an inspiration for the novel. Another great episode, is always a joy to listen in. Took me the weekend to get to this time, so apologies if I'm late for taping. So yeah, I will say, I did read these chapters along with Mason's journal, and that definitely adds a very interesting element to the reading. So if you haven't done that, I would definitely suggest doing that. I'll drop the link in the show notes again for anyone who's curious, because it's a really interesting read.
In news on our Instagram, I should have put this in the group chat, but a user named Literary Lumen did comment orale in Spanish, the Spanish word orale, or the Spanish slang term, on my post about us having a new episode up, which I believe is the first non-scammer comment that we've gotten. So
yeah, that's good.
Time for celebration. Open up the champagne.
That's right. Well, yeah, we appreciate the comment. That's awesome. And yeah, thanks everyone for listening. We will be back next week to talk chapters 56 through 60. And we look forward to having that discussion. So thanks again for listening. Check us out. All our social media links are in the show notes. And we'll see you all next week.
Bye.
see ya.
Oh, Luke, I finished the first book in Illuminatus trilogy, and I'm starting the Golden Apple now.
Yeah, I finished the first one last week, and then I think I'm gonna trade off that trilogy with the Valis trilogy, with Philip K. Dick's Valis trilogy. Yeah, I did write like a pretty long review on Goodreads for the first one. I did really enjoy it. It definitely does remind me of Pynchon. It kind of reads like Pynchon, but like, I really like that you compared it to Vonnegut. But it definitely reads like Pynchon, but like if Pynchon was it's like Pynchon on steroids almost, or something. Like if Pynchon was like, even like, like Pynchon was like trying to parody himself or something.
Yeah, I can see that. It felt like it took the conspiratorial side of Pynchon and just really leaned into that.
Yeah. And I do think Pynchon probably tries much harder to base his stuff in reality, whereas I think that's kind of part of the whole point of that trilogy, or at least the first book, is playing with what's real and what's not real, which definitely comes into play, especially I think in the final chapter with all the discussion of believing things you hear or not believing things you hear and all that stuff. So
Yeah, it's definitely more surreal than most of Pynchon's stuff. It's interesting, I think, that it's written around the same time that Gravity's Rainbow was, just because of some of the parallels to that. Because this came out the year after, 2 years after, 75.
yeah.
So I thought that was interesting. But yeah, it's I'm liking it. It's I'm gonna keep going through because it's a library book for me, so I kind of have to get through it at a certain point.
One thing I did find a bit problematic about the Illuminatus book is it's definitely, I mean, I get kind of annoyed with people who, and I annoyed with myself whenever I do this, but like if that book came out today, like, it'd have to, its portrayal of women would be sensationally dragged through the mud. I don't know. I did write a little bit about that in my Goodreads review, which I don't know. I mean, like thinking of the 60s and 70s, there's a lot of that kind of the attitude espoused in that book in literature.
Yeah, it's it's one of those things where I try to read it as a product of its time, but even sometimes it just gets to be too much, and it's just kind of cringy. And yeah, there's definitely a lot of that in there.
I can't tell. I mean, it does. The whole thing is tongue in cheek and at least attempts to be self-aware. And I haven't finished the trilogy. You haven't finished the trilogy, but I do I don't necessarily get the impression that that's going to be at all justified or redeemed.
It certainly doesn't seem that way. I kind of it would at this point, because I'm almost through the first book of the second book. Makes any sense?
Yeah.
It at this point would take a lot of heavy lifting to kind of undo a lot of that. So I don't know. We'll see.
Because I mean, it's in a lot of ways pretty next level even for its time. I mean, I was just thinking about because Philip K. Dick does get some mud slung at him in terms of his portrayals of women, but they're not just, like in that book, they're just kind of merely sex objects. They don't seem to serve much of a purpose, and none of the leaders are women and stuff. I have read the Valis trilogy before, but I've been realizing as I've been reading it, that I didn't really retain much. I think that was kind of I think partially because of how wild those books are, especially Valis, the first one. I was kind of smoking a fair amount of weed while I was reading it, so it doesn't really help with memory issues. So
yeah. I haven't read that particular trilogy of his.
Yeah, I think it's kind of more of a loose trilogy. It is definitely like the first book especially is like about half of it, like barely. I mean, it like a lot of it's not really even like about it. It's pretty loosely a novel. It's in a lot of ways kind of a like a philosophical kind of treatise, and it's also definitely it seems like he's like Philip K. Like there's all this stuff with like Philip K. Dick and because his like the main character of the book is named Horse Lover Fat, and I think like that's like a it's a different way of it's like if you translate like Philip and then Dick into like different languages, that's like you come up with those words. But yeah, so it's like Horse Lover Fat is like the he of the book, and he's kind of like the POV character, but then Philip K. Dick like breaks in his eye through a lot of it. And but he's kind of like both characters, but like the characters talk to each other. And it's definitely, I don't know how much you know about the whole like him going crazy in the mid 70s.
Yeah, I've read a little bit about it.
Yeah, because it's definitely this weird like he's definitely kind of like investigating and like going over his own delusions, and like it's this weird thing, like you can tell that he wants to believe that his delusions are real, but he also knows that objectively that's like the dumbest fucking thing to believe,
Mm-hmm.
So it's, I mean, it's definitely a trip. I enjoy it. I bought like I have like a book that has all three of the trilogy in one, and I bought it for like pretty cheap considering I think it goes for like 30 or 40 online. Um, and yeah, I've been really enjoying it. It's definitely, like I said, it's not, there's not a lot of plot, but it does share some similarities with like a Scanner Darkly, with like kind of investigating
Okay.
the aftermath of heavy drug use and like friends dying and stuff like that. To go back to the Illuminatus thing, the Illuminatus book is like super. It's like one of the most like 70s books I've ever read.
It definitely, yeah, it definitely is.
It's like super of its time.
I'm curious of if, because I know they wrote more books together. I think they did another trilogy, Robert Shea and Robert Wilson, but apparently they did I think it was a 9-hour stage adaptation in London a long time ago.
Yeah, I did see something about that.
I thought that was interesting. I don't know that I could sit through a 9-hour performance of anything, but I'm sure it was interesting at the least.
Yeah, I think I have a copy of the first book and the second trilogy, and I think it's just Wilson that did it, I want to say.
Okay.
Because I bought that at a bookstore, and then because I thought it was like the actual first book of the actual trilogy, and then I guess it's like the sequel trilogy. I think there's like 2 or 3 standalone um novels as well, and maybe like a nonfiction book that kind of gets into some of the supposed historical basis for it. It's also because it's kind of similar. I feel like a lot of the stuff about the assassin guy seems to me like it's kind of, I've never played the Assassin's Creed games, but I've like watched people play them, and it seems kind of similar to that to me. I don't know.
I'm familiar with the games. I haven't played them either, but I could
Yeah,
see that connection.
I think they're kind of similar and maybe based on similar historical stuff. I don't really know. The only times I've ever played them, like I whenever I was in grad school, I was at a party and someone had it on, and I just flew around as an eagle for like 20 minutes.
That sounds like a good game. I would get into that. I did finish Ken Liu's Grace of Kings. It was okay. I went back and read some reviews of it from people on Storygraph, and a lot of people, I felt the same in that a lot of people were saying that it felt more, you could see his career as a short story writer coming through a lot more, because it felt like a lot of short stories kind of in a like not necessarily forcefully put together, but almost as if that's how he wrote it, was just a series of short stories, then found connecting threads to tie them all together. But apparently like his writing, as far as like long form writing, takes a huge leap in the next book in the series. So I'll stick with it and check out the next one. But it was not bad. But you know, knowing that the writing gets better kind of gives me the drive to keep on with that series at some point.
Yeah, one of my main problems with fantasy is, and like the excerpt that I read from that series, is that it's all, I'm not sure if this is like it's what I like, it's all fantasy seems to almost always be written in what I call like fantasy voice, where it's like super middle of the road descriptive prose, you know?
Yeah, that's fair.
And it seems like a lot of like, even in writing workshops I've been in, I've had like fellow writers who are writing fantasy, and it always seems like it's just always like the same. It seems like it's like the same narrator in like so many different books, basically, where they all like sound similar and use similar like language and vocabulary, and it's like it's trying to be like good prose, but it never like tries for like any like actual like pyrotechnics or anything like that impressive.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a fair assessment. I think there's definitely exceptions to that, but that's through and through. I've read a lot of fantasy. That's definitely the case. I think it tends to be that because those books, and I hate to be reductive, but those books tend to kind of exist more, I think, for pleasure reading rather than like a real literary showcase. I think there are authors who have that ability and do showcase it well, but I think generally within that genre, I think it tends to take a prose and as you put it, the pyrotechnics tend to take a backseat to just creating. I think to world building more than anything. So I think it has its own unique place in literature. But yeah, that tends to be. That's why I kind of tend to go back and forth between fantasy and other genres. If I read too much of fantasy, I tend to just get burned out because of that. Like you mentioned, the similar narration style. I tend to just kind of get too much of that, and so I like to balance that out with other kind of heavier stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've been wanting to get into the Gormengrass trilogy.
Yeah, I have that on my list. Our library has it. I think I'm gonna jump onto that soonish. I don't know. That one's been on my list for a long time.
Yeah.
If you like,
you go on.
If you like that kind of, from what I've read a little bit of the first Gormenghast, the Titus Groans, I think is the first one.
Yeah.
If you like that, I think you would probably like the that Mordu book that I read a while back. I just read the sequel Malakoi earlier this year, and it was really good. But Mordu was very similar in style, I thought, to Gormenghast. It had a very like very gothic and kind of like a Neil Gaiman-esque style of prose. And it played with a lot of interesting themes and styles within the book. And then the second book did even more of that, which was really kind of interesting. A lot of the second book kind of went back through the first book, but through a different viewpoint, and kind of made you reassess what had happened in the first book. So it's really interesting. And the third book, I think, is going to come out next year. But you might dig that one.
Okay, yeah. I trilogy at Half Price Books, but I've been last month I went a bit crazy buying books, and I had to control myself.
I've been there.
All right, I'm back. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
It's all good.
I spilled a protein shake not only on my copy of Mason and Dixon, but my keyboard, my laptop, my microphone, and my body. So I had to take a very quick shower there.
Jeez.
And hopefully my keyboard will work. But I'm back and good to go. My e-reader is not turning on. My copy of Mason and Dixon was rained on 2 days ago, and now it's...
Jeez.
Now there's some protein shake on it. So, yeah, this is fun. I think Kate was completely right. This is a cursed episode.
It's starting to feel that way.
But back and raring to go.